Hello and welcome back to my channel, or welcome for the first time. If this is your first time, here, or if you are not subscribed to this channel yet, please consider subscribing. It does help me out. I know that sounds weird, but it does. And I apologize in advance for my heater. It is freezing in here, and so I'm going to keep my heater on. So I hope it doesn't. I hope it's not too distracting. Okay, so I did a video responding or looking at Chris Roseborough's video on Rosh Hashanah, and you can go check that out on the channel, on my Caleb Haig YouTube channel. And on that video, I got a response or a YouTube comment, and here's what that comment says. Ian wrote on that video, and he says, "Have you ever thought of Jesus in terms of Hillel and Shammai split? It has been my belief that Jesus was mostly supportive of Hillel's halakha. This would make Jesus unpopular with the majority of Pharisees since the Shemites held political power at this time." Okay, I want to break this down for everybody who might not know what Ian is talking about here. First of all, within the Talmud, it talks about this great split and this great debate that happened between these two houses. And when it talks about a house, it is kind of talking about a school of students, like a teacher and the school. So obviously one of those schools is Hillel, and he is said to be the head rabbi or the leader of this school. And then the other one is Shammai, and Shammai is the leader or the leader or the rabbi of his school. And it is set up within the Talmud and a little bit in the Mishnah as well that these two schools basically disagreed on everything. But it said that their daughters still intermarried. So we kind of get this picture going in our heads of these two different groups of, like, think of maybe like a religious school. I mean, I suppose you could think of like maybe like a seminary today, but it wasn't. The schools back then are not probably what most people think of. It was probably a teacher who had disciples that lived with him and studied under him and kind of lived life with him. And we see this even in the Gospels, right? We see Yeshua, Jesus, his disciples, they're with him all the time. They travel with him. They live life with him. Some of them have certain roles. So, for instance, Judas has the money bag, and he's in charge of the money, so on and so forth. So we can think of the same kind of schools in terms of the Hillel and Shammai thought pattern. Okay. And then he uses a word here, halakha, and I'll describe this real quick for those who might not know. Halakha, the word halach in Hebrew just simply means to walk. And so halakha is the way that we walk out the commandments of God, that how we live our life in accordance with God. And so when Ian says, "It has been my belief that Jesus was mostly supportive of Hillel's halakha," what he's saying is that even though these two schools fought all the time and they disagreed on everything, Jesus took the practice of Hillel, and he was more supportive of that practice. So that's what Ian's saying here. Hillel and Shammai are reported to be in the 1st century BC, so sometime within 100 years before Christ came. Okay, so what's my view on this? This is probably one of the views that I have received the most pushback on, not just from Jews, religious Jews and non-believing Jews, but even from Christians and from people who are well studied. And the reason why is because I am not convinced. This is very controversial. I am not convinced that Hillel and Shammai were real people, and I'll tell you why in just a second. But before I tell you why, I want to say this doesn't mean that I am not convinced they were real people. They certainly could have been real people. There could have been a person named Hillel, and there could have been a person named Shammai. And that doesn't really matter for my view on this. And so now let's dive into why I think that. Okay, so one reason I'm skeptical that Hillel and Shammai were real people is because we have no historical evidence of them prior to the Mishnah. I believe that the Mishnah was written sometime around the 4th or 5th century CE, and I know that some people are going to try to date it earlier. I don't think we have any proof of that. In fact, a lot of people don't know this. The first manuscript that we have of the Mishnah doesn't come. First full manuscript that we have of the Mishnah doesn't come around until the 11th century CE, and there is reported to be some scraps from the Cairo Geniza, which was in the 7th century. However, the scraps that we have are so small that it makes me wonder if they were actually of the Mishnah or if they were recorded sayings. And I know that I'll get a lot of pushback for that because people will say, well, that's all the Mishnah is just recorded sayings. What I'm saying on this point is simply that I'm not convinced that there was necessarily a full Mishnah as we have it today, compiled like that, even in the 7th century. But for argument's sake, I will place the Mishnah sometime in the 4th or 5th century. The Talmud doesn't come around until later, until after that. Like I said, the first manuscript that we have of the Mishnah is actually in the 11th century, but it's contained within a manuscript of the Talmud. So the first Talmud and the first Mishnah that we have complete manuscripts, and some of the earliest manuscripts that we have of these writings are in the 11th century. And outside of the Mishnah and outside of the Talmud, we have, to my knowledge, and I could be wrong on this, but to my knowledge, we have no mention of Hillel or Shammai in any other writings. So Josephus doesn't talk about Hillel and Shammai. Philo doesn't talk about Hillel and Shammai. The Gospels never mention Hillel and Shammai. We have reference to Gamaliel, obviously, or Gamaliel. Obviously, Paul was taught by Gamaliel. And we have reference to a Sanhedrin, 70 elders that are essentially working for the temple, or they're the council within the temple in Acts, okay? But we don't have any reference to Hillel and Shammai. And since the Talmud and the Mishnah place these two figures as like the schools of thought within the first century, it seems to me that you would have some reference to them. Now, people are going to most likely say, and I've heard people say to me, well, we don't have reference to Christ, to Yeshua, to Jesus, outside in non-canonical literature such as Josephus. Now, this is debatable. Obviously, there are references to Jesus within Josephus. However, some people believe that those were added later. But outside of that, we really don't have reference to Jesus. Now, even that is not exactly true. There are some references in some Greek annals of Christ later. They are later, and they mostly reference the followers of Christ. So it has been argued to me that, well, we don't have a lot of witnesses outside of the Gospels of Christ being on earth. Well, my response to that is yes, but we do have the Gospels, and the Gospels are 4 separate witnesses, all from the first century, that report a full life story of Christ and his dealings around Judea. And not only that, but we have very early manuscripts that are very close to the first century. Some people argue that we even have some manuscripts from the first century. There's a manuscript that's reported to be of Mark from the first century. This is all debatable, but there are certainly manuscripts from the second century that we have of the Gospels. So there are clear witnesses of Christ in the first century. Another argument that we could pose against my belief here is that we don't really have a lot of witnesses for other people. So we don't have witnesses for Plato or Aristotle until much, much later. And this is true. But I think that there's a theological reason here for a concept of Hillel and Shammai. And let me kind of lay that out first. When the temple fell in 70 CE, this was a huge event, obviously, and it left Israel really kind of reeling and not knowing what to do. Their central place of worship was gone, and really the Judaisms of the first century were really focused around the temple. And so once this temple is gone, Judaism is kind of lost. The various sects of Judaism don't know what to do. And you have, at the exact same time, you have this extremely quick rise of Christianity that is kind of, taking everyone by storm. And the converts to Christianity are huge at this point. and there's significant data for this, obviously, that the spread of Christianity was huge and even continues today. So the Judaisms of the first century are left wondering what to do, and this continues on, I think, even after the first century. Now, people are going to say that there was already an oral Torah, or that there was some customs, and we see this in the Gospels. We do see this in the Gospels. In fact, Christ himself speaks against the custom, how convenient you uphold the customs, but you neglect the Torah. I'm paraphrasing, of course, but the point is that Christ, for instance, Mark 7, specifically speaks against the customs as opposed to the Torah. So certainly there was customs that the Pharisees and other sects believed and followed after. But I don't think that there was a unified oral Torah. I don't think that there was a compiled oral Torah. And what I mean by that is I don't think that people were memorizing the oral Torah as we think of the oral Torah today. The Mishnah itself, I believe that the Mishnah itself was an invention after the fall of the temple, and I think quite a bit, I think several hundred years after. I think that it was an invention to try to retain Judaism after the destruction of the temple. In other words, the Jews are now scattered, and they want to retain, they want to maintain Judaism. They're seeing a lot of converts to Christianity. How do they do this? Well, one of the ways that they can do this is to have a set structure of culture and religion. And so I think that this is essentially how most of, not all, but most of the Mishnah is now written down. I think that it was kind of a compilation of various different views and various different ways that practices that the Jews could do to solidify a standard Judaism after the destruction of the temple. Okay, so with all of that said, what about Hillel and Shammai? Why would I think that they might not even be real people? And the reason for this is that Hillel and Shammai, they represent two polar opposite views. And I think that the Judaism that is now emerging after the destruction of the temple needs these polar opposite views. In other words, they need to attribute to different people or to different groups certain things that can show different viewpoints. And the easiest way to do this is to say, well, there were these two schools. And whether or not they were real or not, could Hillel and Shammai be real? Certainly they could be. I think of like stories of my great-grandfather that I've heard, like, oh, my great-grandfather Schwartz used to say this and this, okay? Or he used to believe this, or he used to do this. Now, how many of those stories are conflated, or how many of those stories now are, the fish is this big kind of a thing? I don't know. But I can imagine that if you're hundreds of years removed from someone, you could say, well, my great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather Schwartz, he used to say. And at this point, you need Judaism to have a voice on each side, two opposing views. And so I can see the idea of, well, there was this guy Hillel and there was this guy Shammai. They were these two schools, and they disagreed on everything. Now, all of a sudden, we have the ability to attribute very different halakha, very different rules and laws to two different schools. And this gives us a standard. And for the oral Torah, now people can say, well, we agree with, the majority agrees with Hillel. In other words, what they're doing is they are now standardizing a specific rule and a specific set of laws to a specific house. And not only that, but they're giving it history. And this is very important. Not only that, but, and this is perhaps one of the most important features of this, they are attributing this history before Christ. And that's important. The reason it's important is because now they can say to the Christians, we had it first. A perfect example of this would be, this wasn't attributed to Hillel and Shammai, but a perfect example of this is the Afikomen. The best evidence that we have says that the Afikomen comes from the word Afikomenos. It's a Greek word meaning the coming one, and that the Christians were the first ones who used this word in reference to the Passover meal. Yet Judaism now takes the tradition of the Afikomen, they make it into a tradition, and they say, we had it first. And so by creating two schools, Hillel and Shammai, that pre-exist Christ, what Judaism, the post-destruction Judaism is doing is they're giving themselves a history of tradition that goes before Christianity, and they're establishing it in two different schools so that they can now take these ideas and they can not only debate them, but they can side with one or the other. And they say, well, I side with Hillel on this, I side with Shammai on this. This is one of the reasons that I'm not convinced that Hillel and Shammai are actual people. I think that they could be concepts of schools. Maybe they were real people. It doesn't really matter. Do I think that the things that are attributed to Hillel and Shammai in the Mishnah and the Talmud were actually believed by two schools of Hillel and Shammai? No, I do not. I don't believe that and I know that, I'm sure that there are great historians and great, scholars in rabbinical works. I know I've interviewed Dr. Instone Brewer before. He is very convinced that there are certain parts of the Mishnah that go back and precede the first century. I have seen his work and I don't agree with it. That's okay. Dr. Instone Brewer is still doing, he's a magnificent scholar. I disagree with him on a lot of things. That's one of them. But he would certainly say that Hillel and Shammai were certainly two schools that go back prior to the first century. I'm not convinced. I haven't been presented with that evidence. Am I willing to change that view? Absolutely. But that's kind of why I think that what we see in the Gospels of Christ's, his halakha, if you will, or the way that he teaches, I think is a unique perspective in the first century that the Judaisms of the time have not seen. And when we read the later rabbinical work back into the first century and say, oh, well, we can read the Gospels in light of what we see in the Mishnah and the Talmud being preached as Hillel and Shammai, I think that we have huge anachronistic problems, and I think that it just doesn't work. And I think that we're doing a disservice to the Gospels as believers by holding that view. That's my personal opinion. And once again, I'm willing to be shown differently on this, but that is kind of where I'm coming from on the whole Hillel and Shammai debate. Now, with all of that said, and I know I've been talking for a long time, but with all of that said, this is a very controversial view, and so I know that a lot of people are going to disagree with this. That's totally fine. If you have evidence of Hillel and Shammai outside of the Mishnah and Talmud in the first century, I'd be very happy to see it and very happy to look at it. As I said, Instone Brewer's timeline and his thought that certain language shows a pre-existence of the Gospels, I have not bought into that theory, and I don't think that the scholarship is actually there. However, once again, I'm willing to be shown differently on that. I hope that this video has done something for you, at least get your wheels turning a little bit, even if you disagree. And please consider subscribing so you can never miss a video, and I'll see you in the next one.